afternoon, and welcome to yet another topical and extremely timely event webinar. This webinar was generously sponsored by an anonymous donor in loving memory of Paulo Ann and David Cooperman. May their memories be as a blessing. As we're speaking today, Ismail Haniyeh, the top Hamas political leader, is in Cairo meeting with Egyptian and Qatari officials talking about another ceasefire. Of course, we're all praying for the safe and speedy return of the remaining 129 hostages still being held in captivity. However, while many in the international community view the Hamas war on Israel strictly in narrow terms as just another Israeli-Palestinian war, this war is very different. This war is all about the Iranian axis of terror and the threat to the entire free world. Wherever there is instability in the region, or in the world for that matter, the long tentacles of the Iranian octopus are behind it. Iranian-backed Hezbollahs are attacking shipping lanes in the Red Sea, where about 12% of international commerce flows through. A new coalition has been formed with the U.S. at its helm to protect these shipping lanes. We are now wondering if the U.S. and our colleagues will simply sit and take the fire from the Houthis, or if they'll respond, and if this is going to widen into a bigger war. Iranian-backed Hezbollah has stepped up the launching of missiles onto Israeli towns along Israel's northern border, firing missiles, rockets, and drones. And there have been ongoing attacks on U.S. soldiers by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. This is an existential war for Israel, but with the long arm of Iran, it's not only about Israel, but about the free world as we know it. And this entire time that the world has been focusing on Gaza, the Iranian centrifuges have not stopped spinning. According to the most recent November 15th IAEA report, Iran has enough highly enriched uranium for 3 nuclear bombs. Cameras in the enrichment facilities that were switched off earlier in the year have still not been turned on. The United Nations met yesterday, and the US, France, Great Britain, and Germany stated that Iran has 20 times the amount of highly enriched uranium called for by the JCPOA. It's clear to some of us that if the Israelis don't win this war in Gaza, there will be more and more October 7th. And it is also clear to some of us that this might be coming soon to a theater near you. Yet calls for the international community for an immediate ceasefire are increasing. Here to discuss this is the renowned scholar, David Wurmser. David Wurmser is a dear, dear friend of ours and of Amet's. He's the director of the Middle East Studies program and a senior scholar at the Center for Security Policy, as well as a fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. David has served as Middle East advisor to former Vice President Dick Cheney and a special assistant to former National Security Advisor and UN Ambassador John Bolton. He has also served in the U.S. Navy Reserves as an intelligence officer at the rank of lieutenant commander. David is also the founder of the Delphi Global Analysis Group. Immediately following the 9/11 attacks, David consulted until January 2002 for the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the U.S. Department of Defense on a war-related classified project on understanding the nature and strategic significance of terrorist groups and their interactions with states. Before entering government, Dr. Wurmser founded the Middle East Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, in 1996. While at AEI, David published the book Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Defeat Saddam Hussein. David received his bachelor's degree, his master's degree, as well as his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University. In addition to his book, he has also been published frequently in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and in Commentary Magazine. It is always an honor and a privilege to have you, David, on our show. David, first of all, do you feel there is a possibility that this can widen into a major war at this point?
Well, I think it is already a major war and it's already widened. It is simply the level of intensity of that widened war that's the question. So, I'd go back. The fundamental issue, as far as I can see it with this war that started on October 7th, was that this was a major strategic event. I realize there are scholars who know far better than me, frankly, far better than anybody I know, exactly some of the details about Hamas's decision to go to war, especially Sinwar's decision. And I know Moti Kedar, for example, and I think he makes a fairly convincing case that Sinwar jumped the gun and maybe went a little prematurely, and the Iranians are pretty angry about that. But I think, despite that, one shouldn't obscure the fact that Iran prepared and made Hamas into what it is for a very specific purpose, which was they wanted such an attack. Maybe the timing wasn't what they wanted exactly, but I think that's irrelevant at this point. We have to understand this war strategically in terms of what was Iran preparing via Hamas. And I think they had three pretty serious goals. The first was to derail the Israeli rapprochement with the Saudi Arabian and UAE countries in the Gulf. This is a terrifying threat for Tehran. They felt encircled. Their aggressive, expansionist, imperialist strategies were running up into a containment wall, and they realized that they can't survive that. So they had to derail that. The second thing, and it's related to it, in my view, is how do you derail it? The peace process between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the real peace process, not the Palestinian one that we lived through so many peace wars. The real peace process with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so forth is anchored, I think, fundamentally to the idea of Israeli strength. It is Israel emerged as the strong horse in a region which America was withdrawing from, apart from the fact that under the Obama administration and Biden administrations, America has not been a reliable ally, not only because it's withdrawn, but also it's shown hostility to its friends at times. So there was really in the region quite a quest for some sort of a structure for survival by some of the countries threatened by Iran, and Israel was emerging as a strong horse and acting independently of the United States to some extent, like in 2015. So they needed to make Israel look like a limping donkey and not a strong horse. So October 7th, what Hezbollah was planning with the Radwan force and the similar type attacks that were being prepared in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, I think were designed to show Israel is so weak that Saudi Arabia and UAE strong horse strategy and the whole peace structure was built on an illusion, and Iran breaks out of that encirclement. And then the third area, I think, with whenever Iran escalates, one has to look to its nuclear program, because I remember when I was in government under both John Bolton and then Vice President Cheney in the early 2000s, whenever there was a threat to Iran's nuclear program from international diplomacy or potential American actions, Iran suddenly would do something to destabilize the situation and launch a diversionary war via Hezbollah or its proxies. So again, I would always, whenever there's some sort of a escalation, I would look to Iran's nuclear program to see what's going on there. So I think those are the three basic strategic purposes of the war. And in that case, this is a major strategic event. This is a major war between Israel and Iran that was fought through Hamas and Gaza, but it is a regional strategic event. For the United States, unfortunately, this is a Hamas-Israel war. It is a particular narrow war, almost a grand police action by Israel against a very specific terrorist group, Hamas. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I think by now it's become clear the real purpose of the war for the United States is not to strategically take Iran down a notch, nor is it really to address the larger problem of Israel's security and threats. For the United States, this war unlocks a tremendous conundrum that it's faced for years, which is it desires a Palestinian state run by the PLO. And the PLO was so corrupt and so weak and so illegitimate that it basically had no currency among Palestinians, and there was no hope of having it rule over the. Look at what's happening in Judea and Samaria. They can't even control their own cities. Even Ramallah, to some extent, they can't control, and that's their main city. So they were a non-factor in a strategy that relied on them being the great factor. So in some ways, for the United States, the big nemesis, of course, for Iran was Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So for the United States, this is a war to make Palestine safe for Abu Mazen. Very narrow, very focused concept. So that puts Israel and the United States not on two parallel strategic paths, but to an intersecting lines, which means that on the narrow issue of Hamas, the United States and Israel were in convergence, and everybody convinced themselves, oh, America gets it now. And they and Israel are lockstep, and that now we have a convergence of concepts. So the Israelis proceeded, and a lot of Israel's friends proceeded, as if these are two parallel lines, which always stay close, maybe not completely coterminous, but they always stay close and forever run close. Whereas two intersecting lines, after that point of intersection, they diverge. And that's what's happening here. So the United States and Israel are beginning to diverge, in my view. And the very fundamental strategic differences are coming. So for the United States, I do not believe there's been at all a shift on the two key paradigms that defines Washington. The first is Oslo. In fact, they think this is a great opportunity to deepen the Oslo paradigm because Israel's destroying Abu Mazen's nemesis. And the second one is the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal paradigm, Iran, which is really part of the larger paradigm, which is that there are moderates and there are hardliners in Iran. The moderates can be dealt with. They're reasonable. They may not be to our liking, but they're reasonable. They're rational. The problem is that whenever there's progress with Iran, hardliners seek to sabotage it. When we respond harshly, it validates the hardliners and undermines the moderates. So escalation is terrible. And as a result, we have to stomach whatever escalations these, quote, hardliners throw at us and keep moving ahead to work to validate the moderates by being understanding and patient and strategically patient. And then the moderates have a vested interest working with the United States, to stabilize the nuclear question. And then moreover, now with this regional problem with all of the proxies out there of Iran, whether it's Yemen or Hezbollah or so forth, I think the United States, again, like with Oslo, it actually sees its paradigm deepened, that we need not now to come only to a nuclear deal with Iran, but we need to come to a larger regional understanding with Iran and enlist the moderates in Iran to help moderate their proxies and to help secure regional stability. So that's how the United States views this war. Israel sees it the other strategic way, which is Iran's tentacles have been unleashed for the strategic purposes I outlined at the beginning. And that really, you have only two paths. You can either take out the tentacles and then focus on the head, or you can go straight for the head and deal with a really big conflagration of all the tentacles and the Iranian response at once. And so the Israelis have that basic question, but they have no illusions. This is a strategic war with Iran, fought through these proxies. Moreover, for the Israelis, they see it as a larger function of American weakness emerging, that America, the post-Soviet collapse moment of the unipolar moment is over. America has cashed in on that. it's cashed in on it again and again. And as we saw in Ukraine, people are beginning to call our credit, and they're reacting. And we're finding that we no longer have the bank of credit that we thought we had. And on top of it all, like the Saudis feel, is that we're hostile to friends at times and fickle. So overall, the problem here is the Israelis are waking up to the fact that there is a global destabilization happening by a sort of conglomeration of countries that are allied, whether it's North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, China, and so forth. And that you have to understand, as I keep mentioning this from shamelessly borrowing from Tolkien, there's a sleepless malice that stirs. It's a climate, but it's also a real countries. So this has to be seen. Iran is a very important member, rising from the level of a mid-level member of that grouping of China, Russia, to really almost appear, because it's really now one of the arsenals of evil and so forth. So strategically, this isn't even just an Israeli-Iran war. This is part of the West's war to defend Western civilization right now. And the Israelis just happen to find themselves, like they did in 73, 67, and 82, on the front line of that war. And because they're on the front line and the front outpost in that war, they're hit first. And the West's slumber and complacence was first reflected there. And that they now are fighting the West's overall war. So I think you can't paint a more dramatic diversion of strategic imagery than what governs Washington and Israel. The second thing is the psychological. I think we do not understand what Israel went through. I was in Israel on October 7th, and I was in Tel Aviv, which is obviously one of the safer places. I cannot tell you the trauma that everybody went through who was there at that time. And now the Jewish community as a whole in the world is feeling feelings we haven't had since World War II. That security we thought was absolute isn't there. And frankly, for American Jews, this is a very, very serious question right now. For 350 years, the American Jewish experience has been deeply intertwined with the American experience and the American idea. And as I mentioned, this global assault on the idea of the West, there is a domestic assault in America on the idea of America. And of course, if there's a domestic assault on the very idea of America, the Jews who are tied to the idea of America since before the founding of America will find themselves once again on the front line of that too. And you're seeing that. So all of a sudden, the security Jews felt and the strength and solidity of American culture, ideas, and civilization is also suddenly crumbling. So what I'm really painting here is such a fundamental strategic, ideational, and social fissure between where Israel is and unfortunately where Washington is. Now, Washington really is where Israel should be. I mean, Israel is where Washington should be. But we have not woken up here. We have not woken up to the threat that we're facing to our ideas, our civilization, and our strategic position. So it will come, but Israel's first in line to get it. So and pay the price for it. So unfortunately, the strategic divergence emerges from who feels what first, not from really what should be a difference in fundamental strategic interests. Israel's interests in America's are pretty convergent. We just don't get it. So just to finish up, I'd rather take a lot of questions. Some of the specifics of going on right now. The Israelis are dealing with Hamas. I think they'll go all the way. I think they will reoccupy Gaza. I think beyond all these strategic questions I mentioned, I think we also have to ask some very hard conceptual questions. In 1973, Israel's concept failed. We all heard that a million times. In 2023, a parade of concepts failed in Israel, not a concept. And we could spend 5 days talking about that, but one right now that I think is very important. and it's very unpleasant to talk about. The problem isn't Hamas. The problem isn't even the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. The problem is we are dealing with the consequences of Palestinianism, this ideology of Palestinian nationalism created by the KGB in 1964. And it's flowering into the flagship cause for progressives in the world, which unfortunately, I believe under the Oslo framework, the Israelis were handmaidens to its revival. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the entire radical progressive camp was really in very deep trouble. They were orphaned and they were crumbling. And Israel sort of threw them a lifeline, a Noah's Ark of sorts, through the Palestinian issue to regroup because the PLO represents the question of 1948, which is the destruction of Israel, which is what the KGB wanted it to represent, not the specific question so many Westerners think, just how do you manage Palestinians who live in Israel or under Israeli control. Anyway, I don't want to go too far on that issue, but what I'm trying to say is Israel has to deal now not only with this major strategic question, but it has to re-examine its very fundamental ideas on the Palestinians, what you do with the Palestinians, and the fundamental threat they face. Because I think even with the destruction of Hamas, there is a residual problem. And unfortunately, as far as I can see it, is there will be cycles, further on and on cycles via the Palestinian issue. So this will not go away, even if Israel utterly destroys Hamas, or even if it has to reoccupy Gaza and the PLO falls apart and Israel has to reoccupy there, it won't go away. So I think we're in a very long struggle with a much larger set of questions that govern Palestinianism that will keep coming back and be used by any strategic enemy of the West that arises today and in the future. So I'll leave that and we can go to questions.
Wonderful. You hit upon so many wonderful but disturbing issues. First of all, there's this viscous, regnant quality of conventional thinking in our foreign policy establishment
Right.
and academia about inserting the PA after this is all done. As you know, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on Monday was just in Jerusalem meeting with his Israeli counterpart, Minister Gallant. And he said, you know, at the end of this, we're going to have two states living side by side in security. They no longer say peace and democracy, but security. And last week, Vice President Kamala Harris had a phone call with President Mahmoud Abbas saying that she expected the Palestinian Authority or the PLO to take over Gaza when this is all done. Looking at the polls, the Khalil Shikaki polls, where it's like 75% of the people, both in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, if you will, and Gaza, do not believe in the PA, and more in Judea and Samaria do not believe in the PA, possibly because of corruption, but you know, for many reasons. What kind of longevity would you give this if God forbid they were to insert the PA or the PLO to govern Gaza after the war?
Longevity, I would measure it in milliseconds, maybe nanoseconds.
Yeah.
It's dead on arrival. It's dead on arrival, again, because I think the very concept of the PLO, which is the foundation of the Palestinian Authority, is the replacement of Israel. It was founded on the idea of the questions of 1948, which is, should Israel have come into existence? And the very recognition of that and the idea of Palestinian statehood is by definition, and especially you could imagine that over decades, maybe people can learn to live with each other. But as constructed, the PLO and the way increasingly global progressives look at the PLO It is a validation of the idea of Israel as a colonial, illegitimate state that supplanted an indigenous peoples, and that therefore there's really only one solution, which is to allow the indigenous people to rule over their homes. And the colonial interlopers are either learn to live under that or go away. And then you have
Be
everything follows from
exterminated or be
or
executed.
exterminate. Well, we saw on October 7th what living
Right.
under Hamas means, which is, you're between rape and death. That's pretty much the only future. So, and by the way, others in the region who are not part of this ideology of supremacism have paid a similar price, whether you're Yazidi or whatever. So this is not unique. And by the way, it has nothing to do with Israel's creation. In 1832, you could read the reports of what happened in Safed in northern Israel to the Jewish community. There was a horrible mess. It's almost 200 years ago. This is before Theodor Herzl was even born. And what you read happened in that massacre reads almost precisely in what happened on October 7th. I'm not going to go into the grisly details, but every detail you see was repeated on October 7th from 1832 in Sfat. And then you have just every couple decades or years, periodic repeats of this in various levels of intensity, whether it's 20 people or 200 people, or even 1,000 or 2,000 almost. It recurs. So we've got a real problem here that goes beyond that. But the bottom line is, when Israel recognized the PLO, it recognized its own illegitimacy. And I think the only way to return this to a situation of long-term resolution is to look at the Arabs of Judea and Samaria and Gaza as a population with whom one has to work out an arrangement for self-governance, whether it's through another structure, through Jordan, through Egypt, whether it's an autonomous entity under Israel, or whatever. It has to be a practical solution anchored to the very foundations of the inhabitants' old traditional structures, and not a state. Because the moment it's a state and you validate the idea of legitimate Palestinian nationalism, it will inherently transform into a negation of Jewish nationalism, because we're not there. Again, maybe in a generation or 3 or 5, there may be some revision of that. Let's just split the difference. But we see no evidence of that among Palestinian Arabs. So, and their allies. So I think there's no workable solution through a Palestinian state. It would just represent a threat. And the threat it represents, I think, was demonstrated on October 7th. Imagine for a moment if there had been an independent Palestinian state run by Hamas, which it would have been, on October 7th as well. And we were dealing with not 3,000 or 4,000 Hamasniks, terrorists crossing the border 5 kilometers in, a few up to 10, 20 kilometers in southern Israel, Gaza envelope up to Ofakim. But we would have been dealing with double that number coming from the West Bank, invading Netanya and Tel Aviv and Modi'in and the airport and everywhere around there. And then Jerusalem would have been overwhelmed from the south and the north. Essentially, 80% of Israel's population would have been under Hamas control, at least for a couple hours, assuming that somehow Israel could have gotten back on its feet from that, which is very dubious. And then, of course, that all assumes that Hezbollah would have still sat on its hands. So I think what we've seen on October 7th is, not only is it unrealistic, but I think it is a fatal concept for Israel to go for a Palestinian state right now. I think that's an absolute for the Israelis. There cannot be a Palestinian state. And if that leads to a major break with the Biden administration, then that just has to be.
Right. After October 7th, I think there's precious little will among the Israeli populace to
Right.
create a Palestinian state. But do you feel that, first of all, in terms of the creation of a Palestinian state, A, but B, in terms of the constraints the Biden administration is putting on the Israelis not to widen the war, do you think that they have the vertebrae to stand up to the Biden administration if they feel it's necessary to go to war against Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah in the north, and maybe the Houthis in the south, and maybe
Um,
Iran?
I always have these arguments with my son, who being 19 has a very crisp, simple view of things, and he's like, "Is Israel going to do it? Is Israel not going to do it?" And then he gets frustrated. I think Israel often does the right thing despite its best efforts not to, and I think that Israel will get there. It will do what it needs to do in the north as well. And ultimately even against Iran, because not only because it doesn't have a choice. You always have a choice. You have a choice to drop the ball and fail. But I think the Israeli people get it, 100% get it. I am struck by the soldiers that I encountered when I was in Israel, and I was there until about 2-3 weeks ago. The determination and the clarity of thought that they have. And they understand that there's no ending this war without the North being dealt with decisively. And there's no way to deal with the North decisively without taking on Hezbollah. And there's really no way taking on Hezbollah without risking a war with Iran itself. And certainly with the Iraqi militias who are taking up their position on the Golan Heights, which, by the way, there's a lot of sirens right now on the Golan Heights. I think the Israelis are very clear-headed about this. They understand the price they're going to have to pay, and they want to just do it because they know this is going to get worse. The illusion of letting a threat build and taking care of it down road is gone. That's one of the other concepts that has completely failed. You deal with the threat early. Don't kick the can down the road. And so I think that's where the Israeli people are. Elites, especially in democracies, always take a lot longer to come around. And there's two reasons for it. One is, having been in government, you're really caught up in answering the mail. It's like drinking from a fire hose. You never have time to stop and think. So you sort of carry the paradigm that you had coming in, you carry them with you as you go along. And you're listening to people on the outside, but only so much. You don't have time. So the changes are much slower on government. You'd think with all the exposure to information, it changes from the top and then the people come around. In democracies, actually, I think it turns the other way around, is the people get it very quickly, and then the government comes around much more slowly. But in a democracy, the government ultimately does burn through to the elites that the people are in a certain place. So I think it will burn through to Israel's elites that the North cannot just end this way, that they cannot just end this war without addressing the problem profoundly in the North. And I hear these talk about 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. I don't think anybody in the North thinks that this is going to go over without a major war with Hezbollah. So I think that will burn through. And the strategic goals of Israel will eventually, I said it, I remember a friend of ours, a very close friend of Sarah's and mine, Harold Rode, actually called me on Shabbat. He's a Shomer Shabbat. He called me on Shabbat morning, October 7th. And he asked me, Dave, where's this going to go? And I remember telling him it's starting like 73, but it'll go like 48, but it'll end like 67. Namely, 73 was the surprise attack, shock, Israel's on the defensive. 48 is that there will be a lot of fighting all over the place, claiming a lot of Israelis. I expected, and perhaps wrongly, a lot of violence in Israel, even among Israeli Arabs. I happily have been proven wrong on that, or at least so far, partly because I think the Israeli Arabs put their finger in the wind. And they saw, wow, the Jews got angry.
So Israeli Arabs
God.
were attacked on October 7th. There were
I think the Bedouin
Bedouin, right,
now have a blood feud with the
right,
Palestinians,
right,
and
right, right, right,
they're very upset. And I think there are a
right,
lot of Arabs in the West Bank
right.
who would have done something, but they're terrified. They see how the Israelis reacted, and I think they're shocked by how angry the Israelis became. And by the way, this is very important for Westerners to understand. When you're in a total war like this antiseptic concept of war we have is not only impossible, but it actually is dangerous and can lead to a much greater moral collapse, because the deterrent effect of a country that is basically is acting as if he went crazy. I mean, I hate to say it, but what we did in Japan and Germany in World War II has guaranteed us now 4 generations of peace, and in my view, at least another 5 to 10 generations of peace. Nobody in their right mind in Japan or Germany can contemplate revanchist ideas and restarting a war with the West. So there is a utility in that, a long-term morality. And I think the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria got that message on October 7th and 8th very rapidly, and they never joined. But whatever, 67, obviously, the reference to 67 is that even though Israel didn't intend to invade the Golan Heights, and frankly, didn't even intend to take Jerusalem when the war started, in the end, it wound up being a tremendous strategic victory for Israel on all fronts that also became a Soviet defeat, not just an Arab nationalist defeat, a Soviet defeat. So I think, again, this war started like 73. It proceeds sort of like 48, less than I thought, but still, and ends like 67, despite Israel's best efforts.
So, David, and before we go to questions, you and I and just a handful of our friends were very unpopular in 1993 during the Oslo Accords, where everybody was just thinking peace now, and that was like an ultimate projection of our Western values onto the PLO. And we were similarly very unpopular in 2005 during the Hitnat coup and the Gaza engagement.
Yes.
And can you just briefly talk about the lessons of the failure of Oslo and the failure of the Gaza disengagement? It should be clear to everyone, but if you just want to capsize that, because, we were really persona non grata in those days, but we both had this horrific feeling that this was no good thing was going to come out of this.
There's an Israeli line I heard over and over and over again since October 7th, which is, I'll say it in Hebrew because it sounds so good, and then I'll say it in English. It's אנחנו חייבים לדבר ערבית, לא מערבית, which means we need to talk Arabic, not Westernism or Westernness. And the point was that Israel thought that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the weakness of the PLO, the fact that the PLO was so desperate for survival that it would accept becoming the agent of Israel's security, ruling a population embedded in Israel. And the trade-off would be survival for compliance. It thought it had such power. Israel thought it had such power that there's no way the PLO could ever challenge that. By the way, it's a similar attitude the United States has after the end of the Cold War. Who would dare? The entire world knows we're so powerful. We won the Cold War. Why would anybody challenge us? It's self-destructive. So Israel proceeded with this mentality, not recognizing that it was undoing. I mean, we could have a whole seminar on this, but in my view, the 82 war, and again, I'm not only unpopular because of what you and I were saying about Hitnatkut or disengagement and in Oslo, I argued that the 82 war was one of Israel's greatest successes. And more than that, it was actually one of the greatest victories in the Cold War and marked the end of the Soviet Union, because up until 82, the Soviet Union was seen as ascendant because its air defense systems were seen to have neutralized Western air forces. Western air forces were our great equalizer to the ground force inequality, we faced in the central NATO front. So if you look at all the articles by all the wise people from 73 to 82, over and over again, you keep hearing that the United States is losing the Cold War, that the Soviet conventional superiority and the neutralization of our Air Force is creating an inevitability of Soviet power. And that led to the idea of trying to harness that power, a pessimism, and trying to come up with rules for the future rather than defeating that power. And Israel suffered under that too. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 82 following the terrorism, the first thing it did is it completely neutralized the Soviet air defense structure, the most sophisticated and concentrated version of it that had been implanted in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. And that proved that the Western air superiority had been reestablished. And with it, the quote correlation of forces that the Soviet Union kept pointing to is going in their favor, that in point of fact, the West was ascendant. And I think that created such a sense of retreat in the Soviet Union and in shock that it really then fueled the Reagan era confidence that America felt and reassertion of American power. It was sort of the initial shot. And then the Americans just ran with that all the way through strategic defense, et cetera, missile defense, and just generally the whole thing, and defeated the Soviet Union as an idea. So the 82 war was so critical. 1993, Oslo reversed that defeat. It validated the Soviet strategy. It validated the core Cadillac issue of Soviet third world policy. It validated the only remaining strategic asset globally that the Soviet Union had other than their nuclear weapons, and turned it from a collapsing orphan brought it into the heart of Israel. And validated Palestinian nationalism and made it this signal issue again, a life vest, as I said, a Noah's Ark for the old Soviet radical progressive alliance. So again, I think that not all problems begin with Oslo, but Oslo was a major defeat until it's revisited and reversed. There will continue to be. I think that the disengagement was a similar image in Israel, which is, let's just call their bluff. Give them everything. What are they going to do in Gaza? They're so tiny. They're so small. We can deter them. What are they going to do to us? Our power will just deter them. And just one missile and boom, we'll flatten them. By the way, some of the similar statements were made with Oslo, too, which is, they won't do that. But if they did, they know, Israel will. So again, more conceptions falling by the wayside. I found disengagement particularly painful because a lot of our closest allies, Sarah, you remember this, actually didn't stand with us on that, which was a big disappointment. We lost some of the people who actually got it about Oslo, didn't get it about the disengagement, but it was, I remember I was in the vice president's office. I remember sitting there talking with Dagan, who was head of the Mossad at that point, and me and my immediate boss, I'll leave his name unmentioned so far, but one can imagine who it was by those who knew, who worked in the vice president's office, looked at him and thought, this is not thought through. This is not thought through. Everything that's gone wrong with Oslo will go wrong 10 times worse with disengagement. And it did. It did.
And so many of my friends had said to me, the world will remember how far Israel is willing to go for peace. The world will always remember.
Well, Sarah, that's another big thing, which is, and I hate, again, another seminar maybe. Israel was created to erase the diaspora mentality among Jews. What Oslo represented, a lot of the arguments, were the conquering of the Zionist effort by the diaspora concepts. the galut mentality, which is you act against your own interest to double down on proving your reasonability. You're trying to make peace with your haters, and you can't. The lesson of the 2,000-year diaspora is you cannot make peace with the hatred of your haters. You can win their respect, and respect carries with it following and support, but you will never make peace with your haters. And as far as the United States goes, who were not Israel's haters, Americans have a very simple view of the world, which is if you have deep convictions, then you're powerful. If you stand for your convictions and you fight for your convictions, even if you're alone, you'll win. America was, quote, great before it was powerful. So when Israel started compromising on its convictions, in the American mentality, it was, well, I guess those convictions don't mean very much for Israel, do they? So why should we help? I mean, if Israel isn't willing to fight for them, then why should we? So I think that we tried to make peace with the hatred of our haters, and we sold out the respect and following we had from our friends. So Oslo, and on every single level, was a catastrophic defeat for Israel.
Right. We're going to turn to my wonderful colleague, Joseph Epstein, who will read some of the questions that came in. But you just remind me of when Menachem Begin said to a senator from Delaware named Joseph Biden, "I am not a Jew on trembling knees." And
Yeah.
that was really okay. Right. Joseph, go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. So we've got quite a few questions. I have one question of my own, actually. You've spoken a lot about the infeasibility of the PA in governing Gaza, as well as the West, as well as Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. When it comes to this area, how come the Israeli government won't allow it in Gaza, but will allow it really in the heart of the country? And I know traditionally members of the security establishment in Israel have said, you know, the PA may be very bad, but it's better than the alternative. Do you think that after October 7th, the Israeli security establishment has taken a lesson that it's not good to be satisfied with bad status quos?
I think, yes. I think they learned that you don't let a threat emerge. Really, this is a strategic concept that emerged from the war of attrition. If people remember, after 67, the Arabs said no, the famous 3 no's, and the war of attrition began, which was a long war of constant warfare on the Golan Heights and the Suez Canal of artillery, and was never reached a threshold of a full war. But it was fairly violent. About 1,000 Israelis were killed in that war, a many-fold more Syrians and Egyptians. And it ended in August 1970, when the Israelis launched a really series of painful air raids, artillery strikes, commando raids, and even shot down probably 2 to 3 dozen Soviet-lead piloted Soviet aircraft, as well as killed the commander of Soviet forces in Egypt. So it not let alone tremendous damage to the Egyptian military. So obviously the Egyptians sued for a ceasefire. The war of attrition was important strategically for Israel, even though it didn't start it, because it pushed the Egyptian army 40 kilometers back. And therefore there was essentially a buffer zone where Israel could see physically the movement of the Egyptian army over those 40 kilometers, mobilizing for a war. So as long as that buffer zone existed, Israel knew it had the time to mobilize its reserves that it would take for that bulk of the Egyptian army to move those 40 kilometers forward. With the ceasefire, Israel watched within hours the movement of the Egyptian forces to the canal, and the 40-kilometer buffer zone started vaporizing immediately. And Israel wanted to restart the war of attrition, and the United States said, you can't do that. Israel said, but we have to. This is strategically very deadly for us. If you allow Egypt to deploy up to the canal, we won't have time to mobilize our reserves. The United States said, listen, you know what? We will give you weaponry that is beyond comprehension, qualitatively better. This is where really the idea of the qualitative military edge was born. It was called that only about 4 or 5 years later, but the idea was born in August to September 1970. And the reason why the United States didn't want it to escalate was because it had a peace plan at the time called the Rogers Plan. So it wanted to give the peace process a chance to de-escalate rather than having a. So the Israelis accepted that, and in doing that, they accepted this concept of let a threat build, and you're so powerful you can take it. You can adopt the second strike strategy, absorb the first strike, and then you can launch the second strike. You're powerful enough to handle it. That failed in 73, but the concept was never revisited. Instead, Israel deepened its reliance on the qualitative military edge and the Americanization of Israel's military and the dependence that Israel was building on American weaponry, and because the weaponry is expensive, on American aid to pay for that weaponry. So Israel actually deepened what had been proven to be a flawed concept on October 6th, 1973, with the outbreak of the 73 war. And I think to this day, that concept has governed Israel's military doctrine, and it's a failed concept, and it failed on October 6th. And I think Israelis now as a people get it. Again, I think elites will take a longer time to get it, and I think the Israeli military will be the last in the room to get it. But then again, many of those elites in the Israeli military will probably not be around in a year. So I think a huge cleaning house is in order, but strategic imagery has to come with it. And I think that's yet another major concept. That's one of the main ones that has to be now jettisoned and fast.
Thank you. So now to turn to questions from our audience. We have quite a few questions asking about who is responsible for current U.S. policy towards Israel, and why does the U.S. want to promote the PA so much despite all of its issues?
I think one really has to be somewhat giving hope over realism to believe that President Biden really is in charge. I don't think he has a particular animus to Israel, but I think one has to look at his administration, the staffers, who are really in charge. And I think you look at Samantha Powers and Susan Rice and Blinken and Burns. I think these are the real movers and shakers, and they're being supported by a second tier of staffers. And this is really the core of the progressive camp that President Obama nurtured, brought into government, cultivated, validated, and raised to the higher levels. In Iran, it was Robert Malley and his network of Iran people. The overall Middle East was Robert Malley and his crowd. Even though he's now out, the entire network set up by him and people like him are there. And I think that they really cut their teeth in the Obama administration, and their worldview is the worldview of the Obama administration. And they owe their allegiance to the progressive camp. And they have an animus toward Israel. They see Israel as a colonial state. They buy the narrative of the PLO. They were the crowd that was allowed to continue and survive by Israel's revalidating the PLO in the Oslo process. They're the very young people who the Israelis themselves allowed a light vest. So to me, the social justice Democrats, these progressives, etc., I believe they're the real motivating force behind policy in this administration. However, the Democratic Party also still has the liberal camp, which is more pro-Israeli, and there are a lot of politically savvy operatives who understand the cost to the center of turning against Israel. I mean, Israel's still a pretty popular issue in America, and it's still pretty popular in a broader sense. Yeah, the youth, it's a headache, it's a terrible thing what we're hearing in the polls, but when you take everybody in America, Israel's still very popular, and the Democrats have a very serious problem. The progressives hate Israel. There's nothing that you can reconcile with their hatred. They see Israel as illegitimate and should be dismantled and given to the PLO, Hamas, whoever. But most Americans still side with Israel. And overall, Israel is seen to be a measure of American strength and weakness. So the center, the center part of the Democratic Party is afraid of being, quote, Cartered. Namely, what Carter faced in 1980 with Reagan in the 1980 election wasn't just the Iran fiasco and the overall economic decline that America faced and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There was sort of an impressionist feeling, a climate that America was on the wrong path and that America was weak and showing weakness and being dragged through the mud. And the center of the Democratic Party still fears that and fears that that could have an effect. So I see politics driving the current administration, and it's being torn between the progressives who really have the balance of power and the older, more traditional Democrats who are simply saying, listen, you are not going to win the center if you go against Israel. And if you don't win the center, you lose the Senate, you lose the House, and you lose the presidency. And I think right now, Israel has tremendous, for that reason, the United States wants Israel, this whole thing to just go away. So it wants Israel to wrap up the war with Hamas immediately, as fast as possible, not escalate, apart from all these strategic things we talked about. Just please make it go away, because the choice is a no-win situation for this, politically, for this administration and for the Democrats. Make it go away. But if push comes to shove, I think the balance of political interests of this administration are not to have a public break with Israel. So I think Israel has far more leverage to stand up for itself than it believes it has.
Thank you. So another question that we got is about the de-Hamasification of Gaza after Hamas's destruction. Do you think this is possible?
Yeah, it's possible, but not on a stopwatch. It's going to take generations. I mean, you have people who know nothing other than the hatred they've been inculcated into. And that hatred is, first of all, ever since the PLO came back in, and the school systems that were radical. But I think the hatred is also deeper than that. I think it's the hatred of Hajj Amin al-Husseini in the 20s and 30s. One has to remember that there's been this radical attempt to transform Arab society, launched by the Ottomans already 150 years ago with the Tanzimat, then followed by the Nazi networks, first of all, the Kaiser's networks in World War I. The British gave into that way too much. The Nazi networks, the Soviet networks, really a revolutionary attempt to take traditional Arab society and make a huge upheaval. And the method of doing that was to radicalize them against the outsider, whether it was the Ottomans or the British or the Jews, the Israelis, the West, the British, etc. So I think you're dealing now with 150 years of radicalization, destruction of traditional society, and that will take generations to fix. And it will require hands-on fixing. It's not something that you can just wait out. You can't bring in UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which frankly works for Hamas. By the way, the head of United States, the National Security Council, Senior Director for Intelligence, the guy who coordinates all the intelligence for the White House, is Maher Bitar. He used to be a staffer at UNRWA, at the United Nations Relief Works Agency. At a time when it was very clear that they were building schools and had schools with missiles and stockpiles of weapons. So either he didn't see, which is not a good recommendation for an intelligence official, or he willfully neglected it, which is not a good thing for an American official. But anyway, that's a whole different story. Bottom line is, you have 150 years of total distortion of Palestinian Arab society. And I don't see that being fixed without a hands-on Western Israeli presence and re-education over generations. So I think what now you have to have is a workable structure where Israel deals with local authorities, very localized authorities, qadis, sheikhs, etc., breaks it up into various smaller independent, not independent, but various smaller entities operating independently of each other, and deals directly with these local authorities to help also rebuild traditional Palestinian society, Arab society, and begin to reverse this 150 years of distortion and radicalization, in addition to the education structure.
Thank you so much. It appears we're out of time, and I'd really like to thank our guest, David Wurmser, as well as the audience for tuning in. If you enjoyed our webinar, please consider sponsoring your own or donating to him. Thank you so much.
Also, I would like people to donate to the Center for Security Policy. David Wurmser is a wonderful intellect and scholar, and we've had a very long, close relationship with the Center for Security Policy for years and years. And yes, thank you so much. AMET does depend on your donations to keep going. So if you'd like to donate to ametonline.org, it would also be greatly appreciated. Thank you and have a happy 2024.